Welcome everyone attending this special live event for Champion Age Diversity Day 2022. Now in our fourth year that the Age Diversity Forum has been the custodian for this Champion Age Diversity Day, and delighted to welcome you all to listen to a fantastic set of speakers and panelists today that we have for you. Truly international, inspirational inclusion leaders, and delighted to be hosted by one of our fantastic champion partners, Hansuke. We're celebrating age diversity in the workforce because age diversity as part of the inclusion agenda gets largely overlooked. So we think it's right to, at least once a year, on an annual basis, let's shout from the rooftops about age diversity. Yes, highlight challenges, but also sing the praises of the benefits and the values that it can bring. The Age Diversity Forum, just quickly, we see ourselves as a global hub for age diversity with a focus on the workplace, offering a very practical approach to ensure that organisations can achieve benefits and values of an age diverse workforce. As I mentioned, the business case for diversity is more prominent, but unfortunately there continues to be challenges in bringing the age agenda to the fore. And this is exactly what we're trying to do with Champion Age Diversity Day. I'm not going to continue anymore. Without further ado, I'd like to introduce our first speaker, our keynote speaker for today, Karina Robinson, who's co-director of the Inclusion Initiative at the London School of Economics, doing some fantastic works between academia and industry, and showing how alignment from research, from data can be used for good decision making by industry. And the Age Diversity Forum is exactly the space that we like to operate in as well. So it's fantastic to have Karina speaking with us this afternoon. After Karina, we're going to go into a panel session where we'll introduce some more fantastic speakers for you. The only bit of housekeeping I'd say at this point is that there is a chat function. We welcome contribution, participation from everyone watching. Ask any questions, any statements that you'd like to put to the audience, to the speakers. We'd be gladly to answer any questions within the time frame that we have today. So if I may, I'm going to pass over to Karina and thank Karina for joining us today. And I know this is going to be fantastic. Thank you, Karina.
Steve, thank you. It's a delight to be here. And thank you both to you and also to Ali Kazimi of Hansuke. And I'm delighted to celebrate Champion Age Diversity Day and for this webinar on valuing age diversity in the workplace. Now, age has been in the news. We've had this Platinum Jubilee, a 96-year-old monarch. She was in her workplace, which happens to be Buckingham Palace. She was out there on the balcony. Again, that's her workplace. And there she was. In the US, we have the oldest president we've ever had. And I know President Biden is unpopular, very unpopular, but I have to admit, as a citizen of the world, I'm rather relieved to have a statesman like him in power at this point when we're facing in Ukraine one of the biggest crises, the biggest crisis of this century. I mean, interestingly, he was also the youngest, or among the youngest people ever elected to the US Senate at age 29. So he's been at both stages of age diversity. And then I've got to mention, just this weekend, we saw a critically injured 36-year-old fighting against a 23-year-old in the Roland Garros final. And this 36-year-old Rafa Nadal is now what they call the GOAT, the greatest of all time. He is the greatest of all time in tennis, and he's got at least 2 Grand Slam matches ahead of others. So age, it's about diversity, it's about being there, and it's also about persistence. Persistence, I say, is the killer attribute. And yet, among all of this, we live in a world that worships youth. It dismisses the middle-aged and the old. A world where if you're over 50, it's going to be a nightmare trying to find a new job. And chances are, if you are employed with stagflation, recession, whatever's coming, your employer is more likely to dismiss you if you're over 50 than if you're younger. Age discrimination exists and it's thriving. Now, if I said to you, youth and innovation, youth and entrepreneurship, you won't bat an eyelid. If I say to you, older worker and innovation, older worker and entrepreneurship, that doesn't exactly slip off the tongue, does it? But in fact, I have my own story of age discrimination. So in a bid, and this is a little anecdote that I've just got to give you because I think it encapsulates what really matters. So in a bid to cut back on the household bills, I decided no more hairdresser because, believe it or not, this is no longer my natural color. I'm going to go gray and it's going to be great and I'll save on the bills, save on the boring hairdresser. So I went out and I bought an Amazon wig just to see what that was going to look like. Now, I am going to show you what it looks like, but I'm not entirely sure I should because it's horrific, okay? Now, I admit it was £3 on Amazon, so maybe one could spend a little bit more, but once I put on my wig, and you admit it's a horrific one, okay? So we'll take it off quickly. But the point is, to me, what encapsulated age discrimination was my 20-year-old son, who took one look at me, and let me quote him directly. Mama, you're supposed to be at the forefront of social change in the city, of diversity and inclusion. If you let yourself go grey, you won't have any credibility. Let me repeat that. You won't have any credibility. So if you're older, what that's saying is you don't look like an agent of change. You don't look like an entrepreneur. You don't look like an innovator. But what is the reality? Let me give you 3 doses of reality. First, the average age of a successful startup founder is 45 years old, according to 2020 research study by Economica. Note the word successful. And let me quote from that study. Among those who have started a firm, and obviously entrepreneurs are all ages, older entrepreneurs have a substantially higher success rate. Our evidence points to entrepreneurial performances rising sharply with age before cresting in the late 50s. I mean, in the late 50s age-wise. If you were faced with 2 entrepreneurs and knew nothing about them besides their age, you would do better on average betting on the older one. I bet you most of us, and certainly that was the case for me, I thought most entrepreneurs were under 30. Wrong, 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 and especially in terms of success. Second dose of reality, the future of work. There's a lot of talk about automation taking away jobs from human beings and about the older generation not being digital natives, which is absolutely true. We are digital immigrants. However, according to a study by the Inclusion Initiative at the London School of Economics, which Steve mentioned and of which I'm co-director, brains and heart win in the future of work. Jobs that require abstract thinking, people engagement, and soft skills are less likely to be automated, according to the research. Jobs that are high on what we call brains, implying they involve abstract thinking, are far less likely to be automated. The authors also find that combining heart with brains will future-proof your job further. Heart basically relates to jobs that involve soft skills and are high on people engagement. Now, I'm now going to give you something that does not come from any research study, okay? It's purely anecdotal. But as a 58-year-old woman, I look at my peer group, and when I talk to them, I think, you know what? We don't need to prove ourselves anymore. We're comfortable with our faults, with our qualities. We've either made it or we haven't made it. We don't take things personally. We laugh at our own absurdities because, you know what? When I was 20, would I have put on a terrible wig? No, absolutely not. In a multi-generational workplace, that lack of ego, that lack of the need for struggle can be very helpful. I think we are, and again, you know, this is not exactly a study, but we can bring people together and help others to shine and come together and do what's best for the company. Third dose of reality. We have a vast skills shortage in the Western world. Labour markets are in flux from the pandemic fallout and technological upheaval. In fact, the OECD says up to 1 billion people will need reskilling and lifelong training by 2030. That's a lot of people. We need more carers, we need more marketing executives, we need more quantum scientists. There isn't any sort of a workplace out there that doesn't need more people and skilled people. In parallel, on the sort of plus side, we have a much healthier workforce of people over 50, over 60, over 70, some of whom want to work longer, some of whom have to work longer due to financial circumstances, and many of whom have the capacity to reinvent themselves. As a microcosm of my third dose of reality, I'll give you an example I've become very familiar with, the world of quantum computing. I won't bore you with the details of how somebody who was in finance and international politics as a journalist became a quantum guru, but I did, and it's perfectly possible. I'm surrounded by people with PhDs, and when I say PhDs, we're not talking one PhD. A lot of them have 2 or 3. They're dealing with molecular simulations, Star Trek scenarios, way out of my comfort zone. But in this ecosphere, you need somebody to bring all these people together. And the CEO of a Google quantum spin-out, which is called Sandbox AQ, a chap called Jack Hidari, he said, and I quote him because I think he's one of the most visionary people in this new field, the number one concern we have going forward is the skills gap. When people ask me, what keeps me up at night? That's what keeps me up at night. The lack of a talent pipeline in quantum and also the lack of diversity in that pipeline. Now, what is this chap? What is Jack Hidari's solution? On the one hand, work with universities to increase the pipeline, but also work with what he calls the existing adult working population. And he talks about how at Google, they retrained engineers who've been trained in one field into learning about quantum. Obviously, you spend money, you spend time on retraining people, but it is going to become the way out of our skills problem. They upskilled engineers, scientists that were already in the workforce, people who already know how to deal with work, with colleagues. And that is the biggest opportunity. That is the key to the skills shortage. Upskill, training, reinvention in any sphere. Let me finish with Top Gun Maverick, which some of you may have seen. And those who haven't should, because it's just great fun, innocent fun. Tom Cruise is 58 years old in it, and he's told by a younger protagonist, the future's coming and you're not in it. Now, not only was he in it, he provided the solution. I won't tell you any more because I don't want to ruin the film for those who haven't seen it. But the solution, we, the older generation, we are the solution. We are the key. And we are the opportunity. Thank you all. Thank you all for listening. And thank you more than anything else to Ali Kazimi at Hansuke and Steve Anderson and the Age Diversity Forum for not just giving me this opportunity, but for inspiring all of us to keep on going and sharing any wisdom we have.
Thank you so much, Karina. Always a pleasure. For the audience, my name is Ali Kazimi. I'm from Hansuke, and what a great talk we've just had. I'm going to ask you to try something. Could you go to your chat boxes on the right-hand side and just type in where you're from, and just to make sure it works. And why I'm asking for that is because we're looking for participation. This is your part of the event. We have an excellent lineup of panelists. We have just heard a really interesting, precise conversation from Karina, who's told us we are the future. So I'm really pleased about that. Karina is, well, if I say city grandee, it's not to age her, but she's definitely a city grandee. I can't begin to tell her of all the things that she's involved in. I don't know how she fits in the time. She's CEO, Chief Executive Officer of Robinson Hambro. Merchant. She started her career as a merchant banker with Morgan Grenfell. She's on the Lord Mayor's Appeal Board. She's former Master of Worshipful Company of International Bankers, Governor of School of London School of Economics, has been senior editor of Banker magazine. So a lot has been packed in. So thank you very much, Karina. Really insightful. And with that, I'm actually going to turn to our other panelists who have equally excellent backgrounds and are authorities in the area and have a lot to contribute to today's discussion. So with that, may I invite Megan, first of all, yourself, and then Denise to introduce yourself.
Well, hello, everyone. My name is Megan Gerhardt. I am a professor of management and leadership at Miami University in Ohio, here in the States. And I am also the author of a book called Gentelligence, a revolutionary approach to leading an intergenerational workforce, which is what brings me here today. So I do a lot of consulting and speaking in the area of changing the way we're having the conversation around generations in age in the workplace, and very excited to join everyone here today. Our book came out a year ago on ChampionAgeDiversity Day, which is how I met Steve, and we decided that that was a fated coincidence. So excited to contribute today on the panel.
Excellent. Thank you very much, Megan. And if I may say, it is the definitive book if you are interested in age diversity. It is of course, it has the academic rigor, but it's very readable and a must for anyone who's interested in this field of study. And part of the thing that attracts me to age diversity is because it affects all of us. It doesn't matter what background you have. So with that, Denise, can I invite you, please?
Thank you, Ali, and thank you everyone for this opportunity to speak today. I'm Denise Lamarro, also based in the US in Rochester, New York, and I have just actually moved from one company to another as of the end of last week. So I was working for Microsoft, and now I am moving into a role at Zillow as the Director of Diversity and Inclusion. And my interest in the generations comes from my work in the diversity space. And I have been involved in beginning programs within the work that I do, specifically for people over the age of 50, as well as supporting all of the different mentoring, coaching, and development opportunities for our employees across the globe. So I'm excited to be here, share some of what I've learned over the years, and pick up some new things as well.
Excellent, Denise. Thank you very much. And it's great to have a practitioner who's a specialist in diversity, and to have done it at such an international level and at such august organizations. So thank you very much, Denise, for joining us.
Thanks.
So we will be taking questions as we go along. So that's why I wanted to introduce you to the chat box. As we wait for any comments or conversations that you want to participate in, I will start off by inviting a comment from Megan, really, because, as we said, today we're celebrating Champion Age Diversity Day. And the theme is valuing age diversity in the workplace. So it has that vocational aspect to it. But if I can ask you a personal question, which is, you've devoted your career and part of your life to studying this. What is it that, why do you value age diversity, and what does it mean to you personally?
Oh, I love that question. I'm happy to start with that. So as a professor, I became a professor when I had just turned 26 years old. So I was relatively young. And that experience for me, I learned, of course, quite a bit from my older colleagues, as most of us do, asking for advice and mentoring and trying to find my way. But at the time, I was much closer in age to many of my students at the university than I was to many of my colleagues. And that was a very unique position to be in. And so very naturally found myself engaging with those younger than me for input and feedback. And I found it to be such a great source of diversity of thought in both directions. I was learning something different depending on the direction I turned, but I found them equally valuable and interesting. And I thought, well, what a great opportunity for learning and different perspectives and better decision making, all of those things that we know diversity overall brings us. And so it aligned, maybe the stars aligned with the fact that at that time was when here in the US specifically, our millennial generation had entered the workplace and was really causing a great deal of confusion and frustration for many older managers. A lot of differences in terms of norms and things, of course, that we all on the call probably are aware of. So I was asked to speak to many groups about this topic. It was aligned with my research interests. And I thought, great, we're going to go talk about all the potential that sits in this age diversity we have. And that was not the conversation that was happening. It was much more frustrating, negative. How do we get them to understand how to do things correctly, right? Sort of an us versus them mentality, which is very pervasive in both the age and generational literature. And I thought, why have I had such a different experience with this? And how can I help reframe this as an opportunity instead of a threat? And so, you know, it's continued to be, I'm not remotely close in age to my students anymore. And I won't say unfortunately, because I agree with Karina. I love that I have that benefit of what my age has given me, but I continue to use that same strategy. And so I do a lot of work in industry, but also at the university and learn daily from my students, as well as, of course, from those who have much more experience than I do. So for me personally, it just makes sense. It's one of those things I feel very strongly and have both the academic and practical research to back up the benefit of this if it's done well. Right. So I think what we're trying to highlight for everyone is that if you leave a multi-age workforce to its own devices, the research, although there's not as much as there should be, would show it's going to be rife with conflict and frustration the way that any kind of poorly managed diversity could be. But if it's managed well and proactively and smartly, which is what Gentelligence is about, there's so much benefit. There's research supported benefit. Age, you know, has such great potential in terms of learning, innovation, change, all of those things we need so much right now. But we have to have a strategy and we have to use the same intentionality and, you know, effort that we do around other kinds of diversity in order to leverage that. So that's why it matters to me. And that's my story behind what drives my work.
Excellent. Thank you very much for sharing that with us. And that probably sort of like, Steve, if I can perhaps ask you, because obviously you're the one who made this thing happen. And obviously it means a lot to you personally. So tell us a little bit about how did you get here and what it means to you?
Yeah, I'll try and keep it as short as possible. I've been very fortunate to have worked in a number of different industry sectors and in a range of countries as well. You know, in finance, in international standards, engineering, as well as international research, designing solutions for vulnerable groups of people. The biggest asset I found with any of those working situations was people. And I founded the Age Diversity Forum. We're going into our 9th year now, which completely amazes me that we are here and assembling such a fantastic panel for this now internationally recognized event. This is what we bring to the table with the Age Diversity Forum. It's all about people. At a macro level, it's a global challenge. In the population trends are described as a global mega trend, with people living longer and healthier, but with varying socio-economic circumstances. And that global economy that we all wish was probably working a bit better than it is right now, is missing out on the strength of collaboration, of innovation that an age-inclusive environment can bring. When we bring that aspiration, that macro aspiration to an organizational level, those that want to be inclusive, and why wouldn't they, even just to be compliant, an inclusion view through the age lens brings everyone into focus. It truly is a completely intersectional opportunity to look at diversity and inclusion in the round. Because as it is for other protected characteristics in many developed countries, it is as wrong, as unjust, as illegal to discriminate for age. I'm going back to basics a little bit here, and I think this was our sort of intent for this event this time, because organizations that are now approaching us have the fundamental challenges of just recognizing that age needs to be on a parity with other characteristics like gender, like disability, like LGBT, like ethnicity, and that age, as I say, can encompass the whole inclusion agenda. So if an organization shifts policy into practice for everyone, whatever their age, the organization then can start to make better strategic decisions that ultimately enhance performance for individuals, the teams, and the business. And to aid that process, one could argue for monitoring purposes, for example, age is probably the one set of data that is most easily collectible for inclusion assessment. There's lots of research and consortia that delve into try to do research, and one of the first parts of that journey is collecting data.
Steve, may I just ask you a follow-up question just on that, which is, we have had a comment as well, which is around that it does fall off the radar when it comes to diversity. In your work, the consulting work that you do at Age Diversity Forum, is there any particular reason why it falls off the radar and people aren't looking at it and not treating it as a diversity issue?
I think there's lots of issues. Why? It doesn't, crudely, it hasn't had the promotion and marketing that other areas have had, and high profile situations that have been recognized for other protected characteristics. It's not as easy to prove age discrimination. There's very few cases brought that actually get to court. There's some that get settled out of court, but it's quite hard to prove. And I think it's in some ways it's part of the way society has developed. The age, as Karina was describing, can be considered a negative without even thinking about the situation. So I think we need to raise more awareness. Age is an ism, like the other protected characteristics. So we need to raise awareness. We need to talk about the values and benefits. And again, this is where we like to invite organizations to recognize the compliancy required in terms of legislation, but then go beyond that policy and put things into practice. So, for example, taking that commitment of being compliant for age diversity and put it into a practical application, organizations can take immediate advantage of broader participation in workplace areas such as recruitment, training, retention of key skills, and know-how that can be transferred and shared across different generational groups. And then that approach can lead to bottom line return on investment for inclusion initiatives. And this is where the conversation goes beyond the moral compass of doing the right thing, which we should clearly do. But it becomes a business-driven approach where everyone has the same opportunities to be the best that they can be.
Yeah, I want to go back to still exploring some of the causes and some of the challenges out there at a deeper level. And, we talked about, if I can call it, sort of like lazy thinking or stereotyping that goes on, you know, and you see this from both ends of the, you know, the ends of the microscope, the lens, as to speak, that you've got the younger people quite often are looking at the older generation as being out of touch or not being technically savvy. And you've got, you know, similar kind of sort of like stereotypes from the other side, whereby, you know, we don't look upon the youth as, you know, having the discipline or being lazy or not doing things in a manner that we think is right or not having the right attitude. So, you know, I don't know, Denise, in your practical experience, you've obviously worked in large organizations with large workforces. Is there an underlying reason? Is there something that can be done to further explore? Because quite often these biases are, by definition, not that apparent.
And that's a great question, Ali. And absolutely, it's yes and yes to both questions. So yes, there are unconscious biases that affect all of us every day, right? We are all a product of our environment, of our generation, etc. And we need to be more aware of the fact that these biases cloud our decision making. So some of the things that I have done through the years to educate all of the generations is I have talked about what generational preferences are in the space of being communicated with, in the way they like to be led, how they prefer to be recognized for their efforts and rewarded for their performance. Things along those lines have gone a long way towards building that level of understanding that will reduce those unconscious biases. I've also worked with recruiters within the organization to make sure that the language they're using in the jobs that they're posting is age inclusive. Ageism does exist in the written word. And if we're not careful how we structure the actual job posting, we will miss entire generational groups. And that goes from the younger spectrum up to the more what I call tenured talent perspective. So some programs that exist out there in the wild that are really beneficial for any company to get involved in are programs like Steve's Age Diversity Forum. But then there's also here in the United States an organization called AARP, American Association for Retired Personnel. They have a couple of really good programs in place that are specifically geared towards people who are over the age of 50. One is called the Living, Learning, and Earning Longer program, and the other one is called Age in Tech. And it stands to reason that people are staying in the workforce 10 to 15 years longer than any other generation prior to. So there will be situations wherein we have the need for assistive technologies because of acquired disabilities as an individual ages. And companies need to understand what that means. So educational programs in that space are really important too. I saw what's an example, the question of what's an example of age appropriate languaging. And really what we're talking about here is making sure that there's clarity in what you're posting for this job's duties and so forth, being very specific about what the expectations are for after hours, what the expectations are for travel related to the role, what the actual roles and responsibilities will consist of. Is there an opportunity for job sharing in this role, or is it, strictly just a full-time position with 24/7 responsibilities, etc.? As people are looking at job openings now, since the Great Resignation has transpired, they are looking for companies that are really going to offer much more flexibility, much more specificity, and in what the role is going to consist of, and really what opportunities there are for them to advance and grow and learn and so forth. So that goes across all the age spectrums, and it's really something we have to do a better job of as the employers to make sure that we state what the role is going to consist of very clearly so that people can make a determination if it's something they really want to apply for. And since people are staying in the workplace so much longer, we have to ensure that there are upskilling and reskilling programs in place for them so that they can stay relevant. Because as Steve mentioned earlier, there is that fear on the part of younger people that those who have been in the workplace for a longer period of time no longer have relevant skills. But then as you're preparing for retirement, we have 3 countries in the world that have the largest percentage of tenured talent, and that's Italy, Germany, and Japan. We have to make sure that cross-training is taking place, that job roles and responsibilities are documented, and that, the person who is getting ready to exit the building is given options to come back in a part-time status, things along those lines, because just because they're reaching retirement age doesn't mean that they're ready to go sit on their porch in a rocking chair.
Fantastic. Thank you very much. I was going to say, in some ways we'll come to this point later on about the direction of travel, but if we just continue the focus on what is the current state of play. Megan, are these stereotypes, we talked about unconscious bias and so on, what is academic research telling us? Are they really quite grained, or, can societies change their outlook?
I think what we found when we were doing our research was that there are very common stereotypes for both older and younger workers. And what I found most fascinating, honestly, is that these stereotypes are perpetuated not just by the quote other. So for example, there's some interesting work showing that older workers tend to be some of the loudest, maybe repeaters of age-based stereotypes about older workers. And there's some speculation as to why. So it's not just younger workers, labeling older and vice versa. It's to some extent potentially proactively defensive, right? Like, well, I'm not one of those people, but here's what we know about those people, to separate themselves. So, there's a lot of evidence showing that they exist. There's also about as much evidence showing that they're not valid. So of course, the one that we hear the most is that older workers are not tech savvy. And you can think about the implications of that. I was on the phone with a client about something totally different, and they were talking about an upskilling program that they were going to roll out. And someone said, well, who are we offering this to? What's our target? And somebody said, well, everyone but our baby boomers, right? Which in the US would be kind of our oldest population in the workplace at this point. And I, of course, did a big red flag throwing up, even though that wasn't why I was on the call. I said, I'm sorry, can we go back? Like, why aren't we offering this to our workers over this particular age? And it was, well, I talked to Sally in the coffee room, and she said that, she sure hopes she didn't have to do that training because she's about done. And I said, okay, but we're not going to make widespread company training decisions based on Sally in the coffee room. Like, maybe she's an anomaly, but so there can be implications of those stereotypes. And, the research shows, this is why, to me, you have to dig deeper, right? You can't rely on that. So the research shows that, older adults are just as tech proficient or savvy as younger ones. The difference is in more subtle things like how pervasive they choose to have technology be in their life. And this is at a group level, right? We're not trying to say this is true for everyone, but it may be that they don't necessarily feel technology needs to be used as much, as often, as constantly, because they have other approaches that work better for them. There, of course, we talked about digital natives and digital immigrants. When you're a digital immigrant, you have to learn things that maybe someone else grew up just knowing. So there's a time curve. There's not a performance curve, right? It's more about interest. It's more about desire than it is about ability. So things like that, I think are still very pervasive and are seeping in an implicit way to opportunities. We know many older adults say they haven't been given developmental opportunities. That's why, with the Great Resignation going on, so many of our older workers who, as Denise said, are not ready to retire are still leaving. They're leaving to go somewhere else, right? We're losing a lot of that strong older talent because they think, well, no one here seems to value me and what I know and what I can do. So I'm going to take my talents elsewhere. So they're still there. They're still having an impact. I think research wise, we're seeing just like most stereotypes, they don't tend to be supported. And the reason is, I think we don't have enough intentional, proactive opportunities for people to replace stereotypes with personal relationships, right? If you get to know someone of a different age at work, which is not a natural thing, we tend to stick to our age groups, then, you know, you don't need to rely on lazy stereotypes. And I use that phrase all the time. And just as a quick conclusion, I was working with a client a couple weeks ago, and I had written something about we need to stop relying on lazy stereotypes. And there was this immediate pushback, you know, well, we're not lazy. You know, that's not true for us, right? And I thought, okay, but I'm going to leave it there and let you think about, you know, why are you going to the shortcut rather than developing those more in-depth relationships?
Megan, can I just come in, because I'm really interested in this, the causes side of things. It's obviously on one side we've just said, look, you know, ageism or age doesn't get onto the diversity agenda as much, but actually sort of like in many respects, it gets a bit more complicated when you put age as a dimension with some of the other diversity challenges. So I remember reading Naomi Wolf's Beauty Myth many years ago, and you know, it talks specifically about the newscasters, the young, you know, sort of like you have the male, older newscaster, and then you put a very young female, but you won't very often find more elderly female newscasters. So, you know, clearly the moment you put age and gender, it has a different play. So between men and women, there are different treatments. I was talking to somebody else the other day, and they said within the Black community, the young Black men are treated very differently to young Black females. So there are these other challenges there as well. So how does the intersectionality work? Do you have views on that, Megan?
I do. It's a topic I've become more and more interested in the last year as I've talked to different audiences, because it does come up. So the way that I think generation and age are best looked at are, of course, as layers of identity, because generation and age are different layers. They're obviously connected, but they're different, right? So I think it's fascinating to then think about, for example, we're all on a global call. And so, of course, your culture and where you are in the world, you are seeing this from a very different perspective. How is age looked at in your culture, right? Do we have greater respect for those older than us versus younger? And that is very cultural. And then, as you said, I did a women's conference a couple of months ago where we focused on the interaction of gender and age, and what does it mean in terms of the norms you grew up with as a female during the period of time you started your career, right? That about, you know, was it acceptable to speak up against, you know, sexual harassment or other kinds of behavior the way that it is more acceptable to do now, and what impact does that make on someone's career choices? The other fascinating conversation I've seen lately is around race and generation, and specifically social justice issues. So I worked with a company where there was a lot of tension about how much change and how quickly change needed to happen around social justice issues that they were dealing with. And so the younger generations and ages wanted change to happen yesterday, you know, right now, very fast. We have to take action. The older generations were very supportive and interested in change, but in a much more methodical, maybe thoughtful, measured way. And how that was causing tension was the younger workers were saying they don't really care about this. If they really cared about it, they would do something now. And the older workers were saying, look, if you really want change to happen, there are steps, there's a process. Let's do it in a way that's going to actually sustain. We've been here before with other kinds of issues, and this isn't a quick fix. And so you're confounding and muddying, you know, this idea of the way a different age group might have experienced or believe something should happen, their norms, their attitudes, with the fact that deep down everybody wanted a change to happen in maybe the same, you know, direction, but in a very different way. And that's why this is not simple. And I think where we lose people in age or generational discussions is where we have lazy discussions about saying, well, all young people feel this way and all older people feel that way. And of course we all disconnect and say, well, not me, because it is complicated. We're a product of many different layers of identity, for sure.
Excellent. Thank you very much. If I can perhaps turn to Karina, and just we've had an interesting discussion there, specifically around the intersectionality side of things, and also Megan briefly touched upon the cross-cultural issues, which I know, Karina, you have had a, you know, illustrious career, you know, international career. And what are your views in some of the things that Megan was talking about there?
I mean, I love, Megan, this idea of lazy stereotypes. We all love them. They make the narrative easier, but they're wrong and they need to be discussed. And I think the more you shine the light of day on them, the better. And I love the other thing that Denise mentioned about biases clouding our judgment, because I believe very much in having open discussions with the groups. And at the Inclusion Initiative, one of the interesting things we found is for a number of years, there was this view that women of childbearing age left the workforce because they wanted to spend more time with their children. So people would say to me, and this was a few years ago when, you know, people would say this publicly, well, you know, why am I going to hire a young woman of childbearing age because I know she's going to leave? And then when we did studies on it, it turns out most of those women were leaving to go somewhere else, that was more supportive, to go somewhere else where they were generally feeling quite frustrated with where they'd reached in their companies and the view that, oh, they might have children or they do have children, therefore they're less committed. So they had stopped in their career path in a company and they went off to smaller companies. They went to start their own businesses or maybe to a bigger company that supported them. So I think one's got to be very, very careful about that. There's so many levels of complication to all of this because you have not only different people, different ages, the cross-sectionality, but you also have, as Sally said, this sort of cross-country ways of working and what's acceptable, where, you know, there are countries where actually the respect you get as an older person is amazing. It's wonderful, but we're not getting that in the West. Now, that doesn't mean we can't have workforces where you have different nationalities working together. I mean, so many of our companies now are global companies and our workforces are global. I mean, in fact, the company I'm working with in Quantum is like a United Nations. We've got Mexicans, Iranians, we've got Brits, we've got Spaniards, we've got Indians, and all of them are coming from very different workplaces, very different cultures. They've ended up in Spain working for a global company. So how you deal with that is an interesting one. It adds yet another layer of complication. And that's with the Inclusion Initiative at the LSE. It's one of the reasons we came up with our sort of executive education online, how to create inclusive workplaces. So we're not trying to teach you how to bring in diversity. I think there's a lot out there on that. It's more when you bring in this diverse workforce, whether it's age, whether it's gender, sexual orientation, how do you get the best out of them? Because it comes back down to something Steve mentioned about profit, productivity. You want to have the best company in the world. People need to love to work there because, you know, there's one hell of a lot of competition out there, and you'll see it in your bottom line. And we are getting more and more evidence about that. But I think Denise would have something to say about that as well, because I also noticed what you were saying about people have different ways they want to work, whether it's as they age or actually whether it's you're young and you also want to do a master's on the side. So I don't know whether I'd hand over to Denise now.
Thanks, Karina. And you made some excellent points there. And I do have a couple things to add. 20 years ago, you wouldn't have seen many people over 50 as part of the Great Resignation that we're seeing today. And that was because of the cradle to grave mentality that existed within the workplace at that time. You got out of school, you went to work for a company, you retired from that company. Obviously, you would want some hierarchical movement up the corporate ladder during that time frame, but you stayed, quote unquote, loyal. But loyalty today is more to yourself and your family's goals than it was 20 years ago. Mm-hmm. So the mantra that existed then, which was live to work, has now flipped to work to live. And that is what is driving a lot of the Great Resignation. And to your point, where people are, women especially, are leaving to go to a company that has their back, has, you know, programs in place to support them. This is very true of all the generations. They're looking for a company that has meaningful work, that has a social impact, and that also supports their people. And you're absolutely right. Megan mentioned earlier that previous generations sometimes had reticence in speaking up, speaking out, because they feared it might be going against them in some way, shape, or form in an opportunity to advance, perhaps be involved in certain programs that are out there, etc. And you saw that was very common among women in the 70s and 80s. They really didn't speak up much, or sometimes when they did speak up, they were spoken over, and what they said was not really taken seriously. Now you take a look at the fact that the Great Resignation, the pandemic, everything along those lines has really given people the time to stop, think, and really investigate whether they're where they should be and why they're there in the first place. But one thing I will mention, and it's especially important to consider, is that people in the 50 plus age bracket are still in some ways hesitant to speak up. And now is Pride Month, and we find that people over the age of 50 who are in the LGBT plus community are still reticent to speak up in the space of healthcare. And if they have been isolated by the pandemic, it's even more difficult for them to figure out how to access healthcare, and not only from a physical healthcare perspective, but from a mental health perspective. So the fact that we find that the millennial generation is completely uninhibited when it comes to asking for help in the mental health space, as well as in the assistive tech space if they do have a disability. And previous generations felt all of those topics were more of a taboo and not to be spoken of. We need to take the reins there, and as companies, and make sure that all employees know how to ask for assistive tech and where they can access assistance for themselves and for their families as they continue to react to this swirl that the pandemic has created.
Excellent. Thank you very much, Denise. That's really insightful. And I mean, the only thing I would just add to what you said is a lot of the discussion, particularly around age, and of course, rightly so, because today we're looking at it from a workplace perspective, but it's often framed by reference to work, and we're talking about return on investment and so on. I mean, I read recently a book which has actually had a big impact on me, which is Ikigai. It's by Garcia, who basically went and interviewed these over 100 people in the island of Okinawa in Japan. And basically, this is the village of longevity. And what was interesting was it's about living a more purposeful life, a more fuller life, which actually goes against, because one of the key things he found, which was important, was the wider social network. So it's not about living purely selfish lives, about what's in it for me type of thing, but it's how you fit into a wider society. But a really interesting thing, and I think as we probably de-emphasize, maybe sort of like we're talking about the Great Resignation, de-emphasize the role of the corporate, I think, and as we build portfolio careers, I think that might be an interesting pathway for us to think about. Anyway, I shall come off my soapbox, and Karina, do you want to come in with something?
Yes, because I thought that was a very interesting thing. I mean, talking about stereotypes, the idea, and from most of my experience and from the research we've done, younger generations, millennials, Generation Z, are more interested in working for companies that have a social purpose or that manage to define a purpose. And what's very interesting, just as an aside, is, you know, I remember giving a speech to the London School of Economics to the graduation class, and I just said, you know, those of you working for NGOs or going off to work for NGOs, you're great, but don't forget that the people working next to you for asset managers, who you think, oh, they're just in it to make money, they're actually guaranteeing the pensions of a whole load of people. So they're doing social good too. It's just not as in your face. But sorry, I let myself be carried off to the... So the younger generations are very clear about who they want to work with and why, and they will often take a job that may pay less and may give them different things, but including that social purpose. But going to that book you're talking about, which I think, Ali, somebody should put that on the chat. The social purpose as you get older becomes a very important thing. And I know for my generation, you had to go out there, make money, and then you were going to go off and volunteer. And yet now all these people are realizing, well, actually, I can do both. And that is one reason to go off and do part-time, or it's another reason to help change your company, because politics seems to be going backwards. You know, we don't have great political figures who are inspiring us, who are making change. And therefore it's through business. The chances are through business, we will be able to make more change. So keeping older generations who want to make more of a social contribution in the business is just as useful as keeping the younger ones who had that in mind from the very first.
Excellent. I'm just conscious of time. So what I'm going to do is, I did have lots of questions, and I've seen there's a number of comments and questions coming through as well. If I can summarize, I think there was a really good question from Eduardo. There was also a question from David, and I think I would like to combine those two and give my panelists, 90 seconds each, and just say, look, where are we heading? You've talked a little about the Great Resignation. I mean, if I ask you to, take out the crystal balls and do some future gazing, if we are here and if Steve would have us 5 years from now and we're on this panel, what are the kind of things that we're going to be talking about? So if I may ask Steve, let's start with you first.
90 seconds, no chance.
It's your party. You're going to have more time.
Can I just say that the discussion, just ahead of me, we have so many examples of working with organisations in so many different areas. Denise talked about lack of training. Our research says training wanes when you get into your mid-30s. I think it was Branson or some business leader says, if you invest in training, people might leave. If you don't invest in training, they will definitely leave the organisation. So, and making that available for everyone. And just, if I may talk about the culture thing just quickly and what Karina was describing, I think that's a massive opportunity when there's different cultures, and the likes of Japan, I think has been mentioned, where there is that reverence for the older person, particularly old person in the family. If that can be shared within the workplace, that culture, that understanding, I think we can all learn a lot from that. We delivered some workshops for industry employee resource groups in India, in Singapore, in New York, in London. And I must say about 90% of the challenges were pretty similar. There were some nuances around culture, but in terms of, but the reason they're similar was, again, what Karina mentioned about truly global organizations now. And as Megan also mentioned, the way that we can communicate now, like through this type of media, just allows us to be more aware of what's going on around the world. So I haven't answered your question at all, Ali, but I think what's next, gazing into the future, in 5 years' time, I think we will still be talking about getting age to some level of parity within the inclusion conversation, just because of a lot of the challenges that have been highlighted today. I think the more success we can have raising awareness with the likes of today, and just quickly, we're hoping very soon that this day is going to be recognised by the United Nations as an international day of recognition. But I think it's an invitation to everyone joining us today to make that change, to put parity in their inclusion agenda for age, because they can achieve some immediate practical gains. We've heard some issues around, recruitment, around training, around retention of skills. The Great Resignation, as this situation is going on right now. And by the way, in terms of the intersectionality, in the UK, ONS data on the back of the pandemic talks about older women being most adversely impacted in terms of unemployment. So you talk about gender, you talk about age, you put the two together, you just, you've got a mushroom cloud of different scenarios. But I would say this, just to end my little piece, the best thing an organisation could do is just demonstrate themselves as an age champion, and we'd gladly help them do that.
Excellent. Thank you very much, Steve. May I go to Megan next? What are we going to be talking about in 5 years from now?
I'm fascinated. I think, I'm interested in how our younger generations will meet the generations after them. I think we've had some really interesting experiences where we've seen the very ugly side of, us versus them, and viewing different as wrong, whether it's older or younger. Will this pattern continue? I've written and talked some about the idea of the millennials were treated in a very negative light and way for being different. Are they doing the same thing in the US Gen Z as they follow them, or will they be more embracing and interested in that perspective? Will the cycle continue? So sort of interested in that. I had a really fascinating question come from, so we had our Harvard Business Review article came out in March on harnessing the power of age diversity, which we were really excited to get that on a bigger platform. And all sorts of people came out of the woodwork to join in that conversation, which was great. And I had a man from, he did artificial intelligence for, I think it used to be Tesla. I can't remember where he works now, but self-driving cars was his focus. So he had this very urgent question for me, messaged me on LinkedIn. I have to ask you a question. Can we meet? Sure. And his question for me was, will people who turn 60, 30 or 40 years from now be more comfortable with technology than our 60-year-olds are today? So all kinds of course, stereotypes that we would want to dig into there. But he basically said, will older people be more comfortable with technology in the future than they are now? I think relevant to self-driving cars. First of all, I was very flattered that he thought I knew the answer to that question, right? Like, I'm very able to look in the future and tell him yes. But those are the questions, right? I think one of my favorite quotes, which I will paraphrase badly, is sort of every generation develops the tools they need to be successful in their own time. And so when you develop those norms, you're doing what needs to be done to meet the needs and the challenges you see ahead of you. And that will continue to change, right? What will people need to be successful in a cross our fingers post-pandemic world? With the new ways of managing and leading, what will that take? It will take different skill sets. It will take different attitudes, things like that. So I guess my hope is that in 5 years from now, age is right front and center with all our other kinds of important differences. I know that's Steve's goal. I think all of us sort of scratch our heads about, well, why in the world wouldn't we be talking about this? It's a kind of diversity we all have in the workplace. Yet I think Deloitte's data on this last year was that only 6% of organizations feel their leaders are equipped to manage it well. So I'm hopeful that number goes up, that it gets awareness and attention and becomes much more ingrained in our conversations about how to manage it well and lead it proactively. That's what I hope we begin to see.
Denise, may I turn to you?
Sure, thanks. So I echo a lot of what's already been said, but I think I hope that in 5 years we are talking more about some of the successes that we've seen and can share best practices more so than ever. That we are seeing people being very confident in speaking up and speaking out, asking for assistance and getting what they need to be able to be successful employees. And that we are seeing employers really responding to the needs of the people, regardless of their backgrounds, their age, where they come from, etc. I also hope for a world where employees feel the empowerment to be able to say to their leaders, this is where I'd like to be in 5 years, and the employer not say to them, well, you're 62 years old. Why do you even think about 5 years from now? Shouldn't you be getting ready to go sit on your rocker on the porch? So I really want that to be the norm. And to Megan's point, we need to make sure that the leaders are provided with the information that they need to be successful in that space. Too often, a lot is put on leaders without them being given a lot. And so companies really owe it to their leaders to truly get them aligned for that success so that they can in turn say to that person who comes to them, I know exactly where to send you. This program will be exactly what you're looking for, etc. So there needs to be more mentoring, more coaching, more reverse mentoring, where it's the younger person in the mentor seat, and the tenured talent is giving some of those history lessons about the company to the newer person. It's mutual, it's symbiotic. And we also need to make sure that the programs we have in place are really in place for the right people at the right time for the right reasons. And they're not just, trying to band-aid something. They're a true solution that will last over time. So it's, combining forces and being more empathetic and understanding. And you can be a diverse company, but that doesn't mean you're inclusive. So paying attention to what the people really want is going to be critical.
Absolutely. So Steve, did you want to come in with something? I thought you raised your hand.
Just really quickly, as Megan brought up sort of the educational side of things. And I didn't want to sound too pessimistic earlier as well by saying, we're still going to be, having similar conversations, but we are desperately trying to make a difference and a change there. But I just wanted to highlight another event that we pre-recorded for today, which was a student roundtable event with the University of Bath. And it can be seen on, I think it's live now on, people can watch it on other platforms of ours. I may ask, I think one of my colleagues is online, maybe they can put the link into the chat box. But this was young students from different degree courses talking really positively about inclusion, but also that they felt there need to be more done about the age conversation within education. So if we can create better knowledge and know-how and understanding of the age agenda whilst people are in academia, when they move into a career, into industry, they're not taking negative thoughts about the age agenda with them. In fact, they're taking very positive opportunities, and how collaboration and partnership between generational groups can be really, really positive for them and for the career that they join. So I just wanted to highlight that was another event that we pre-recorded that is live now elsewhere.
Absolutely, that's a great, the link is there now, and I haven't watched it yet, but I will definitely be sure to watch that one. I think interestingly, Steve, it's the 5-year question is an interesting one, because hopefully we won't go down the Max Weber theory of organizations and hope that we won't be talking about age diversity in 5 years' time. But talking
well,
of
as I say, I think there is much work to be done, and we haven't even spoken about policymakers yet either, and about what can be done like in the UK with gender. In the last 5 years, companies of a certain level now have to report on gender pay gap. It's just a massive shift in policy and legislation. But how many years has that taken? So whilst we're very energized to keep raising awareness, and events like this, I think, are just fantastic, with a great panel to share the opportunities and the values. Yeah. I think there's still a lot of desks to be pounded and a lot of flags to be waved to get the message out there.
Absolutely. I mean, it's interesting you mentioned the University of Bath, and it'd be interesting to watch this. I know, Karina, I'll ask you the same question about the 5 years, but I do know that you're doing some work at the LSE around some of these challenges. Perhaps you might want to just mention that as well before you answer the question about the 5 year.
I think the LSE, the Inclusion Initiative, I don't think we're doing enough on the age agenda. I definitely don't think we're doing enough. We need funding for PhDs who can follow their interests and develop things like that. And at the moment, because this doesn't have high enough visibility, one's not getting enough. So the more the Megans and the Denises and the Steves and you and your supportive role, Ali, are out there, the more this will be on people's agendas. And then you start getting everything else fitting in, whether it's the policy, the papers, the books. I mean, I look forward to Megan's next book. And your next book, Megan, will be so much easier to sell because you've put this on the agenda already. Mm-hmm. And what I would suggest, if I may, 5 years from now, let's have the same panel and let's have the same discussion. And I bet you we will be much, much further advanced.
And we won't be sitting in rocking chairs either.
Absolutely not. Well, thank you very much. You've been a wonderful panel. I've really enjoyed it, learned a lot, lots of interesting insights. And I hope our audience will agree that, we have had an interesting discussion. We had a great talk by Karina, albeit brief, but it was a very insightful talk. We talked a little bit about, what it means to some of us from a personal level, what drives us. We talked a little bit about the lazy societal stereotypes, intersectionality, cross-cultural challenges, and also some of the sort of like practical aspects of what we could be doing, as well as some future gazing. So it's been a really quite a packed discussion that we have had. And if I may, if you'll allow the indulgence, the 5 year thing is something that is close to my heart as well. And it is very difficult to, as Megan said, we don't have a crystal ball that we can predict the future. What we can do is talk about it aspirationally, where we hope things will be. And I think, like any other form of diversity and challenges, I faced at a practical level as a minority, I know how it feels when you are marginalized, and it's not a good feeling. And I think generally what people are hoping for is actually, at a very simple level, is respect as a human. And there's nothing more complicated than that. And if we can achieve that, we can look upon fellow humans and be blind when it comes to color, sex, gender, age. I think that's really the kind of society that we want to progress towards. But thank you very much. Thank you to our audience. And a big thank you to Steve and to Age Diversity for. Thank you very much, guys. Hopefully, take care, stay safe. Goodbye.
Bye now.
Thank you all.